bombshell opener. A 19-year-old terrorist sits in a cafe eating a sandwich, believing he's failed his mission. Suddenly, the most powerful man in Europe rolls up in front of him. 2 gunshots later, 20 million people are dead, 4 empires have collapsed. And our modern nightmare begins. This is the assassination that ended the world as we knew it. Welcome to Dark Decoded X. I'm about to show you how one wrong turn in Sarajevo became humanity's greatest tragedy. Hit subscribe, because this story will change everything you thought you knew about our world. But first, you need to understand the powder keg that was already set to explode. The powder keg Europe in 1914 was a ticking time bomb. 4 massive empires, German, Austrian, Russian, and Ottoman, ruled over a million, who hated their guts. Secret alliances crisscrossed the continent like tripwires. Germany promised to defend Austria, Russia swore to protect Serbia, France backed Russia, Britain guaranteed Belgium. It was like a room full of armed men, each with their finger on the trigger waiting for someone to blink first. The arms race was bankrupting nations. Germany doubled its military spending in 5 years. Britain and Germany were locked in a naval competition that was bleeding both empires dry. But here's what they don't teach you. Young men across the Balkans were joining terrorist organizations with names like the Black Hand. These weren't just political protesters. They were assassins stockpiling weapons and planning to murder royalty. The most dangerous was a sickly 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip. The powder keg of Europe refers to the Balkan region in the early 20th century, a hotbed of political instability and conflicts that preceded and ultimately helped trigger World War I. On June 28, 1914, this teenage radical nationalist would get his chance, but not the way anyone expected. The assassination. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, decided to visit Sarajevo on the worst possible day, Serbia's national holiday. It was like painting a target on his back. The Black Hand positioned 6 assassins along his parade route. The first attempt failed when a bomber missed and Franz Ferdinand's driver sped away. The Archduke had cheated death, or so it seemed. Here's where fate reveals its twisted sense of humor. Ferdinand's driver took a wrong turn down Franz Joseph Street. As he tried to reverse, the car stalled directly in front of Moritz Schiller's delicatessen, where Gavrilo Princip was drowning his sorrows, convinced his mission had failed. Princip looked up from his sandwich and couldn't believe his eyes. His target was sitting motionless 5 feet away with no security between them. He drew his pistol and fired twice. The first bullet struck the Archduke's wife, Sophie. The second hit Franz Ferdinand in the neck. Within minutes, the most powerful empire in Europe was planning revenge that would consume the world. July crisis. 30 days to hell. What happened next wasn't inevitable. It was a masterclass in how incompetent leadership destroys civilization. Austria-Hungary didn't treat this as a terrorist attack. They saw it as an excuse to crush Serbia forever. They delivered an ultimatum so harsh that accepting it meant national suicide. Serbia agreed to almost everything. It wasn't enough. For 30 days, Europe's leaders played a deadly game of diplomatic chicken. Each empire thought it could control the situation. Each was catastrophically wrong. The Kaiser sent his blank check to Austria. The Tsar mobilized his army. The French activated their alliance. The British prepared their navy. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. August 3rd, the war on France. On August 4th, Britain joined the bloodbath. In 37 days, a local conflict became a global apocalypse. The leaders who promised their people a quick victory were about to preside over the greatest slaughter in human history. Everyone said it would be over by Christmas. They were wrong by 4 years and 20 million corpses. The Western Front, hell on earth. Imagine 400 miles of trenches stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. A scar across Europe filled with mud, rats, and death. Between the opposing armies lay no man land, a moonscape of shell craters and barbed wire where showing your head above the trench meant certain death. The Battle of the Somme, 60,000 British casualties in a single day for a few yards of worthless ground. Verdun, 700,000 French and German casualties in a brutal 302-day battle fighting over the same hills. Young men climbed out of their trenches knowing they were walking into machine gun fire, following orders from generals who never left their safe houses. This wasn't war. It was industrial-scale murder. Poison gas dissolved your lungs from the inside. Artillery shells could be heard 100 miles away. A single machine gun could cut down hundreds of men in minutes. The old world's gentleman's code of warfare died in the mud of France. But while Europe bled itself white in the trenches, something even more horrifying was happening in the East. Entire empires were collapsing, and from their ashes, the most murderous ideology in history was about to be born: the Russian collapse. By 1917, Russia was hemorrhaging. The Tsar had thrown away 3 million men in battles that achieved nothing. Soldiers were deserting en masse. The people were starving. Revolution was inevitable. First, the Tsar abdicated. Then the moderate provisional government fell. In October 1917, Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks seized power with a promise that would echo through the 20th century. They would build a workers' paradise from the ashes of the old world. Instead, they built a gulag system that would murder millions, more than the Tsar ever dreamed of. But Russia's collapse had an immediate consequence. It freed up millions of German troops to be transferred to the Western Front. Germany now had one last chance to win the war before American reinforcements arrived. Meanwhile, America was being dragged into the abyss by a secret telegram that would change everything. The Zimmermann telegram, Germany's proposal for Mexico to attack the United States, was intercepted by British intelligence. America, the one major power that had stayed clean, was now diving headfirst into the bloodbath. But as the world focused on the war, something far deadlier was spreading in the trenches: the forgotten pandemic. While armies slaughtered each other, nature was preparing its own revenge. The 1918 Spanish flu pandemic killed more people than the war itself, between 50 and 100 million victims worldwide. Young, healthy adults were dying within hours. Cities became morgues. The war had created perfect conditions for a global plague. Massive troop movements spread the virus across continents. Overcrowded military camps became breeding grounds for mutation. Soldiers brought it home to every corner of the world. But here's the terrifying part. The flu primarily killed people in their 20s and 30s, the same demographic being slaughtered in the trenches. Humanity was losing an entire generation to war and disease simultaneously. By late 1918, Germany was finished. Their spring offensive had failed. The British naval blockade was starving the home front. American troops were arriving at 10,000 per day. On November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to Holland like a coward. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. But the war's real consequences were just beginning. The death toll. Let these numbers burn into your memory. Germany, 2 million military dead. Russia, 1.8 million. In France, 1.4 million, an entire generation of young men, was erased. Britain, 900,000 from across the empire. Austria-Hungary, 1.1 million. Total military deaths, over 9 million. Civilian deaths, 7 million more. But those are just numbers. The reality was entire villages in France where no young men returned. British schools where entire graduating classes were wiped out. German families who lost every son. Russian peasants who starved while their government collapsed. The survivors came home broken. Shell shock, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, affected millions. Literature, art, and philosophy reflected a profound disillusionment with civilization itself. The optimism of the pre-war world was dead, buried in the mud of Flanders fields. And then came the peace conference that guaranteed another war. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't a peace treaty. It was a blueprint for an even more devastating conflict. The Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was written by men consumed with revenge. Germany was forced to accept complete responsibility for the war, pay reparations that would bankrupt the country for decades, limit their military to 100,000 men, and surrender 13% of their territory. They had created the perfect conditions for a demagogue to rise to power. A failed Austrian artist named Adolf Hitler would exploit German humiliation and economic desperation to launch an even more devastating war, just 20 years later. But Versailles did more than set up World War II. Four centuries-old empires, German, Austrian, Russian, and Ottoman, simply ceased to exist. The map of Europe and the Middle East was redrawn by diplomats who had never lived there, creating artificial nations with borders that made no sense. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, countries created from imperial corpses with ethnic groups that despised each other, forced to live together. These artificial boundaries would fuel conflicts for the next century and continue to this day. But the war's darkest legacy wasn't just political. It created the template for our modern nightmare: the birth of total war. World War I established the rules for modern conflict. Entire populations mobilized, civilian targets legitimate, propaganda as a weapon, victory at any cost. It gave birth to technologies that made World War II even more devastating: tanks, aircraft, chemical weapons, and radio communications. The war's aftermath created perfect conditions for extremism. Desperate people turned to radical solutions when democracy seemed to have failed. Fascism in Italy and Germany, communism in Russia, all direct consequences of the chaos and economic devastation left by the war. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire turned the Middle East into a powder keg. The borders drawn by European powers in 1919 never made ethnic or geographic sense. The conflicts we see today in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon all trace back to decisions made by men in Paris who carved up the world like a turkey. Meanwhile, America emerged as a global superpower for the first time, reluctantly inheriting the role of world policeman from exhausted European empires. The final truth about World War I will disturb you. The wound that never healed. World War I wasn't just a war, it was the suicide of Western civilization. The old world of kings, empires, and aristocracies died in the trenches, and what emerged from the wreckage was our modern world of total wars, surveillance states, propaganda machines, and weapons of mass destruction. Every conflict since 1918 has been a continuation of World War I by other means. The Cold War, the Middle East conflicts, the rise and fall of communism, and even the war on terror are all consequences of that wrong turn in Sarajevo. Here's the ultimate irony. A war that started over the assassination of one obscure Austrian archduke ended up killing more people than every previous European war combined. It proved that in the modern age, one bullet fired by one teenager could literally end the world as we know it. World War I, four empires collapsed: German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and from their ruins at least 15 new countries: Poland, Finland, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, briefly, etc. Were created or reborn. Powerful outro. So the next time someone tells you that one person can't change history, remember Gavrilo Princip. With 2 shots on a street corner, he didn't just kill an archduke, he murdered the entire 19th century and gave birth to our modern nightmare. What other single moments in history changed everything? Drop your theories in the comments. If this opened your eyes to the truth they don't teach in school, smash that like button and subscribe to Dark Decoded X for more hidden histories that shaped our world. Remember, history isn't just the past, it's the blueprint for understanding why our world is still burning. Until next time, question everything, trust no one, and never forget, the past is never really dead.